The American Civil War, that conflict that this country experienced in the 1860s, was not a civil war. And I don't just mean in the sense that war isn't civil. I mean, it was not a civil war. It was a war of secession, not insurrection. There's a big difference. We had a war of secession with the King of England in 1776. So get ready, because what you think you know about the war between the states in the 1860s, I just might be turning on its head. Prepare for a masterclass, self-described masterclass on that conflict of the war between the states. The War of Southern Secession. Now, first off, let's get one thing straight. Slavery? Bad. I mean, the modern concept of what we know as slavery, and we get into nuances of what it meant in ancient times. Look, modern slavery, the concept of one human being being the possession, legal-like possession of another human being, is wrong. Abhorrent. I'm not a fan of it. In fact, I hate that idea. It is a vile concept. All right? We all agree on that? Number two, yes, the southern states seceded from the Union in order to preserve that institution. No argument there. There may have been some other ancillary things that they threw in, like, did you know? There's a number of things. Read the Confederate State Constitution. It's interesting reading. It doesn't all have to do with that slavery. The only time in American history where a post office ran exclusively on the postage it sold with no other source of funding was in the Confederacy, because the Confederate post office was constitutionally bound to operate only off of their postage. And there's some other things in there restricting bills to but one subject. So, we get tired of all these 5,000-page bills with rider amendments and poison pills and things that have nothing to do with the main point. They ended that. The president had a line item veto. Those are all kind of, while we were at making a new constitution and forming another country, we'll throw that stuff in there too. That wasn't the reason they seceded. Yes, the reason they seceded was to preserve slavery. And that's a dumb idea. All right? But let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back to the American Revolution. It started in 1775. We declared independence in 1776. 1781, George Washington wins the Battle of Yorktown, effectively securing that independence, and it officially becomes officially official by the King of England, recognizing in 1783 13 independent and sovereign nation states. Not one country, there wasn't one United States that he recognized. He recognized 13 independent countries. Yes, Rhode Island was its own country, which is weird because the smallest county in Wyoming is larger than the state of Rhode Island. Funny. But that's the way it was. And there was the Articles of Confederation, and that wasn't working out, and they all got together and said, hey, we need to have a central government. And so in 1787, they meet in Philadelphia, have the Constitutional Convention, bang out the Constitution. It's ratified in 1788. Elections are held. George Washington is elected as the first president, and the government takes effect in 1789. That's important. In fact, going forward from that date, there was a dispute over when the birthday of the country, when the founding of the country was. Was it 1776? Or was it 1789 with the essential activation of the country of the national government, the federal government? Or 1788 with the ratification of the Constitution. Maybe it should be 1788 when the Constitution was ratified. Not a hard date in there because it was ratified during different days, but same thing with the Declaration. It wasn't all signed on one day. All the signers didn't sign on one day either. So anyway, there was that debate, and there was a debate, hey, after the Constitution was passed and went into effect, we should name this new country. Some people thought would petition for the name of the country to be Columbia, because Christopher Columbus was a pretty important figure. Later on, another country wound up taking that name. Fredonia was another name floated about. And ultimately, it was rejected to name the country because the country was the states. People identified all the way up through the Civil War with their state. They were a New Yorker, or they were a Georgian, or they were a Michiganer, or they were a Virginian. They identified with their state. The states ceded some power to the federal government to create it. And they wanted to make sure that that concept was there. If you name the whole country something, one name, because United States is kind of a mouthful, but if you do that, then you lose the identity of the states. The states formed the Union just after having fought a war of secession from the King of England, and formed this union voluntarily. Now, people may say, well, secession's not in the Constitution, so there was no right to secede. They didn't have to put it in the Constitution. They just fought a war of secession and voluntarily formed this union. Now, they voluntarily ceded some power, like interstate commerce, that sort of thing, so South Carolina wouldn't put taxes on things from Georgia, tariffs on things from Georgia. In a modern sense, you wouldn't need a passport. There weren't passports back then, but in today's lexicon, to give you an idea, you wouldn't need a passport to go from one state to another. Free movement among the states, that sort of thing. The powers of the federal government, and the federal government itself, was created by the states. So the federal government is subordinate to the states. That's why when the southern states seceded, they named it the Confederacy, put that con prefix in there, making sure that the federal government, the national government, emphasizing the fact that it is subordinate to the states. Of course, just having it another United States would be confusing. Anyway, so you really think, ask yourself this question, time for critical thought. You really think the founders, after fighting a war of secession on the premise that governments are instituted among men to secure the rights of people, and that they derive their just powers from the consent of the government? And when people no longer consent to that government, they have the right to sever ties with that government and form their new ones. It's a right. It was a right to form new government if you no longer consent to being governed. Now, the funny thing about rights is you don't need to justify them. The justification becomes important when you start looking for popular support. But, like I said, the funny thing about rights, you don't need to justify it. You have the right to free speech. You can say the dumbest, most asinine, hateful, and vile thing you want. As long as not a call to action to violence. You can say what you want. You can say things that are untrue. You can say that the earth is flat and we never landed on the moon. Or if the earth is flat and we didn't land on the moon. You can say the earth is round and we did land on the moon. You can be as wrong as the day is long, but you have a right to say that. Us on the right with the 2A side, you have a right to keep and bear arms. You have a right to own a gun. You don't need to justify it. So, you don't need to justify anything to execute your right. It is a right to break the bonds of government, break relations with them, and form new government if you no longer consent. And they didn't have to put that in the Constitution. That's what the founding of the country was based on. That's what the whole American Revolution was based on. You think they needed to write it in there to say, oh, we're not handing down the Constitution to a bunch of idiots. Along comes the 1850s and 1860s, and slavery was on its way out. A lot of people, a lot of lost causers and things like that, and say, oh, slavery was on its way out. It was on it because, it would have ended in the Confederacy because of mechanization and the cotton. No, it was on its way out because it was on its way out. And it was the last gasp of the slaveholders to try and hold out this global movement. When I say global, I mean in the civilized Western world. In Europe, Mexico, Russia, the Tsar of Russia in 1861, 2 years before the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, the Tsar of Russia freed the serfs. There was this just worldwide kind of movement, and it sent slave owners in the South into a panic. And so, yes, when a Republican, not necessarily Lincoln, who would have been any Republican that they nominated, was elected, they panicked and like, all right, that's it. We're bouncing. We're out. Because the Republican Party had as its platform abolition. And Lincoln himself was one of the more moderate, saying we're not going to have any expansion of slavery, but I'm not going to do anything about it in the South. So this great emancipator line of horseshit is just that. Lincoln was no great emancipator. He signed the Emancipation Proclamation, but we'll get to that in a minute. So yes, this is not some lost cause neo-Confederate rant about how it wasn't about slavery. Yes, the secession was about slavery. And the Confederates ain't got to be good guys in this whole discussion. All right? Both sides can be assholes. Zelensky's an asshole, and so's Putin. There. You know, the quasi-Nazis that were running the apartheid state of South Africa, they were assholes. But so were the communists who took over afterwards. Yes, Nelson Mandela was an asshole too. He was a communist. Both sides were assholes. Lincoln was an asshole, but so was the South. But here's the big thing. Here's the kicker. The South had a right to do what they did. So the secession was about slavery, yes. But why did the North want to keep them? Why did the North fight to keep them into the Union? Secession was something that wasn't even an exclusively Southern thing. You know the first state to secede? Connecticut, during the War of 1812, in protest to that war. Now that issue wound up getting resolved when that war ended. Connecticut was like, oh, well, we'll just come back in. But it was seen as a tool in the toolbox for states to check federal power. It wasn't the only time that it had been brought up. It wasn't all about slavery. There were different varying reasons that a state might, pull that card out of their pocket. Again, it was something to check federal power. And there was a secession crisis of sorts under Andrew Jackson. And every time this happened, the federal government would come in and the other states say, all right. You want to secede? I know you want to secede. Got it. What's it going to take to keep you in the Union, man? Come on. Let's talk about this. And so compromises would be made. They'd bang out their differences and everybody would go home happy. Or at least not so mad that they wanted to secede anymore. So that's how it was working. It was kind of that nuclear option. Not something you pull out willy-nilly, but it was a nuclear option before there were nukes, to check federal power. If things are getting way out of hand, now it's advantageous to stay in the Union for all the reasons, interstate conflict, okay. But if it gets too big of a problem where it's not advantageous anymore, we'll leave. And that's the way it was seen. So Lincoln takes office. Back then, the president took office in March 1861. 7 states, 7, seceded. Federal troops had been left at Fort Sumter. At this point, 7 states had seceded. Not the 11 that it wound up being. Now, they had a right to do it. That's the way they saw it. So now they have their own country, and they formed in those intermediate months between the election and the inauguration. They banged out a constitution to say, hey, we're our own country now. These troops are within our borders. You need to get them out. You need to go home. If we had foreign troops from whatever country, Russia, China, I don't care, Great Britain, Canada, that were in our border, occupying a position within the United States borders, regardless of how they got there, regardless if it had been invited in to begin with. But we told them to leave. They were armed, uniformed, regular troops of a foreign power inside our country. And we told them to leave. And not only did they not leave, that country was sending an armed convoy to reinforce that position. What do you think we do? I ain't waiting for them to open fire. Lincoln started the war. He was a warmonger, and he was a big government authoritarian, snuffing out states' rights to secede, snuffing out, taking away a power the states had to check federal power. Anybody who knows anything about the war between the states knows that Abraham Lincoln wielded far more power than any of his predecessors. Lincoln was an asshole. Abraham Lincoln was an asshole. He was an authoritarian, statist, warmonger. If the troops from Fort Sumter, if those federal troops had been withdrawn, there wouldn't have been a war. There would not have been a war. It wasn't a war of insurrection. There was no insurrection against the federal government. They weren't trying to take over the federal government. They were trying to separate from it. Under a dumbass idea, but that was all right. I I do wholeheartedly, 100% believe that slavery could have been ended. We could have ended slavery. We could have preserved the Union. And we could have done it without over 620,000 Americans killing each other and leaving half the country in a smoldering ruin. Thanks, Abraham Lincoln. Way to fucking go. And increasing the power of the federal government. That's why this is important, this discussion. Because we got conservatives, people on the right, they lionize Lincoln because he was the first Republican president. By today's standards, he's a rhino. I know, kind of hard to call the first Republican president a Republican in the name only. But by today's standards, that's what he would be. It wasn't until Bob Taft, some call him William Howard Taft, I call him Bob, when you know him like I do, that the Republican Party really started to find its footing as an anti-central power party. That's another thing. You got Coolidge, you got Eisenhower, you got Reagan, you got the Goldwater movement in the 60s. Okay. Republican Party back in those days was not what you would recognize it as today. So there's that. But Lincoln was not a great emancipator. He didn't care about freeing the slaves. He said if he could keep the Union together by keeping slavery intact, he'd do it. If he could preserve the Union by abolishing slavery, he'd do that. If he preserved the Union by keeping slavery in some areas and abolishing it in some areas, he would do whatever it took to preserve the Union. And he did. As the authoritarian power monger he was. That's not how you preserve a Union. And you might be asking, well, if a Union is not preserved by force, what is it preserved? What's holding the Union together? Shared values? Anyway, Lincoln, not the great emancipator. In fact, the war in early 1862 was going favorably for the Union. Did he sign an Emancipation Proclamation? No. In fact, the Republican-controlled Congress was worried that the war would end, the rebelling states would be brought back into the Union with slavery completely intact. Because a General Hunter, I believe was his name, who was a friend of Lincoln, had freed some slaves, or the Union general said, hey, I got these slaves, I'm going to free them. Send a letter up to Lincoln. Lincoln responded by sending a memo out to all his commanders saying, you absolutely will not do that. No, you don't go freeing anybody's slaves. I will be the only one to make that decision. So the Republican Congress was trying to pass a bill that would require states to come back in the Union as free states. They were worried that he was going to veto that. and an Emancipation Proclamation was not militarily necessary because the war was going well for them. Now, I did mention 7 states had seceded, and that's what he was dealing with in the secession crisis when he took over, when he was inaugurated. His actions of trying to, active aggression, trying to reinforce a position inside the Confederacy, started the war and caused 4 more states to secede. And you can say the first 7 seceded to preserve slavery, and the other 4 that joined them were slave states, but you can't say that they initially wanted to secede to preserve slavery. Because it wasn't until after the firing on Fort Sumter, Lincoln asked for 75,000 troops to put down this rebellion. And they were like, no, not going to do that. With those 4 states, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas. Tennessee, Virginia, and North Carolina were very populous states. Arkansas, not so much. But Texas and Florida were very rural, sparsely populated, low population states. Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee, those, and then Arkansas. Those 4 states joining the Confederacy doubled their population and doubled their resources. Way to go, asshole Lincoln. Instead of letting it go, letting it simmer and say, hey, what's it going to take to bring you guys back in? He started a war, the deadliest, most destructive war in American history, and pushed 4 more states, moderate states, into them. Another thing about the whole thing, those 7 states that first seceded and formed the Confederacy, there were 7. There were still 8 slave states in the Union at that time when Lincoln took office. There were more slave states in the Union than out. Border states, they remained border states, they remained slave states. So this war is going on. I know that was a little out of order. Should have talked about that. But the war is going on. And it looks like it's going pretty well for the Union. And that it's going to be wrapped up in a couple of months. And the Union will be preserved, and so will slavery. But a funny thing happened on the way to Richmond. Robert E. Lee, Bob Lee, I call him Bob, and you know him like I do, he's Bob. Bob Lee took command, was appointed command of what would become known as the Army of Northern Virginia, and proceeded to kick ass. This is why Bob, General Lee, is the best general of that war. I mean, people say, oh, well, he eventually lost. If he was so great, he would have won. Well, look what he had to deal with. He was outmanned and outgunned. But look, he turned the tide of the war. Not getting into politics and whatever and who was on the right side. Look, that's not about it. It's just straight up General Lee, what he did, what he was able to accomplish with what he had is proof that he was the best general. Was eventually beaten by Grant, but Grant took over in 1864, well after the Battle of Gettysburg, the turning point of the war, and was just a competent officer. Not putting Grant down, but he was not a military genius. He was just competent. It's like, I could lose 3 or 4 or 5 men for every one that Lee loses. It's not going to matter, so we might as well just press the attack. That's how that went. But anyway, Lee turned the tide of the war in 1862. Now things are not going so well. Now an Emancipation Proclamation would be militarily necessary. It was not done because it was seen as not being militarily necessary. Well, now the whole point of this was to start a slave revolution, a revolt from within to take out, basically start another front. But they couldn't sign it because it would be an act of desperation with them going back on their heels. The Union Army being pushed back. Until the Battle of Antietam. Late in 1862, bloodiest day in American history, single day battle. Gettysburg was deadlier, but over 3 days. Antietam, 1 day battle, single bloodiest day, god-awful battle. All because McClellan happened to be given Lee's orders, his battle plans. A fluke of luck gave McClellan the advantage. And he actually could have won that battle. It was a draw. He could have finished off Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia, but he didn't have the stomach for it after what had just happened. Late in the day, I think it was the Second Corps, could have just committed them and finished off Lee. But after the god-awful just slaughter that had happened, he backed off. Anyway, Antietam was effectively a draw, but it wasn't a loss. So close enough to a victory that Lincoln signs an Emancipation Proclamation, goes into January 1st, 1863. It was a military move to try and get slaves to revolt. It didn't apply to border states. It didn't apply to the counties that now consist West Virginia, which was still claimed by Virginia. It was a state that was created by this war. Virginia still claimed West Virginia, what would become West Virginia. So it didn't apply to them. It didn't apply to Union-controlled territory in southeast Louisiana. It didn't pertain. It was explicitly cut out the port of Norfolk, Virginia, which was held by Union. Any place that the Union held was explicitly cut out. You think if you're going to start freeing slaves, you would start with the territory that you took and be like, hey, we're going to go free all the Jews in those concentration camps, except the ones that we already liberated. They're still going to be in concentration camps. But Nazi Germany over there, those concentration camps you have to free the Jews. Huh? Why would you do that? Because it wasn't about freeing slaves. It was about trying to win the war. Speaking of West Virginia was created as a state, first off, unconstitutionally. You need the permission of the other state. And if the premise is, you could say, well, it was a war. It was holding that territory and they were trying to break away. They were trying to hold it. Well, if your premise is these states are still in the Union, then the Constitution still is in effect to them. And in order to create a new state from another state, they need to have permission of that state. West Virginia was created unconstitutionally, but it was added to the Union as a slave state. In a war that was ostensibly to free the slaves, you create a whole brand new state as a slave state. But they were going to phase out slavery. There was a deal in place that they had to phase. No. You don't get away with that. No. If the war was about freeing slaves and you just created a new state, it will be a free state. You're going to start with that one, wouldn't you? No phasing out. No, this is a brand new state. So, no, they weren't trying. The war wasn't fought to free the slaves any more than World War II was fought to free Jews out of concentration camps. As a result of the war, Jews were freed out of concentration camps. As a result of the war between the states, the 13th Amendment was passed and slaves were freed, but that's not why it was fought. Hey, riddle me this. Here's another critical thinking moment. There was a sentiment among Northern abolitionists prior to the war that they should secede from the South because they didn't want to be in a union with slaves, where slavery was a thing. Maybe not a huge sentiment, but let's just say that happened. Should the Southern states have fought the North to keep them in the Union? Abraham Lincoln was a piece of shit. It didn't have to come to a war. I made a video about that, about rushing to war, being a warmonger. Didn't have to come to that. We could have preserved the Union, we could have freed slaves, and we could have done it without the damn war. Without more bloodshed in those 4 years of American lives than any and all other conflicts combined. Didn't have to happen. Abraham Lincoln imprisoned over 13,000, I think. A lot of people with the suspension of habeas corpus. Not a few here and there who were working with the Confederacy and were maybe, trying to muck up things in the North and were Southern stuff. No, 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 no. Anybody who basically disagreed with him, he rounded up. He rounded up a third of the legislature of Maryland. I think he tried to actually arrest the entire Maryland legislature. We're talking judges, clergymen, congressmen. Arrested him, held without trial, without formal charges. That's inexcusable. We're not talking like a onesie and twosie, oh, there was a Confederate spy. No, wholesale. He destroyed printing presses of newspapers of his opposition. Destroyed their offices. He had to draft. He had to institute the first draft in America. And when people protested against the draft, he ordered federal troops to fire upon them. And this is not rubber bullets and tear gas. This is before they had that. Used deadly force on his own people, on his own population in the North, in the Union, who were protesting the draft. Way to go, asshole. We need to stop lionizing Lincoln, and we need to realize this, because here's why it's important that the federal government doesn't have this power. This sent down a snowball effect of increase of federal power. That's why this is important. We need to start understanding this. All right? And on the warmonger side, the Confederates were just as guilty. They thought that they could whip the North, no problem, in a couple of months, and it was going to be over like that, because they didn't feel that they completely miscalculated the amount of resolve that the North would have. They figured, our country is founded on revolution. Our country is founded on secession. If we want to break away, most people up there, and there was a lot of people up there in the North who was like, well, let them go. They want to go, let them go. They ain't none of my business. The abolitionists in the North, a lot of them were like, well, people who wanted to secede from the South because they didn't want slavery in there in the Union. It was like, well, this problem seems to be resolving itself. Okay. So there were a lot of people who disagreed with the war. And in fact, in 1864, Lincoln was doing so poorly in his re-election effort, he had to dump Hannibal Hamlin, his original vice president, get an illiterate Democrat, Andrew Johnson, as his running mate, and had to destroy the opposition press. So yeah, he was against the First Amendment as well. He probably, talking about election interference, yeah, where the opposition isn't allowed to voice their opinion. He probably would have lost that election if not for silencing his opposition. Then he had to get Grant in command because things weren't going well on the battlefield. They still weren't making it. Even after the battles of Gettysburg, they weren't making any progress towards winning. Grant was finally the guy to just say, well, we're just going to press the attack and keep going. But he also allowed, Grant really wasn't that bad. But Bill Sherman was. William Tecumseh Sherman. Bill. I call him Bill. General Sherman, March to the Sea. Anybody realize that? Or remember that? Yeah. Did Lincoln do anything to stop that? No. He knew about it. He like, go ahead. Destroy cities. Burn them to the ground. Wipe them off the map. Wipe Meridian, Mississippi, Atlanta, Georgia, Columbia, South Carolina off the map. Is that the way to unite a country? Is that the way to preserve the Union? They didn't just go to war. They executed total war. Thanks, Lincoln. Thanks for destroying half the country that you were trying to preserve. But the South did not. They miscalculated the resolve of the North. That enough people were going to join initially to stop them from seceding. So that's on them. But also Lincoln and his high command, when they first took office, they looked at the situation and they misjudged the resolve of the South. Because slavery was one of those things that like only the rich people had. Like I think 8% or something. That you get down to, it's like, I remember reading the USA Today article. This is USA Today, not a bastion of conservatism or any apologist for the thing. They're trying to get this number up as high as possible. They can only get to 20, 25% who benefited from slavery. So that's still a vast majority of the population of the South did not benefit from slavery. All right. It was kind of a rich elitist thing. Maybe some guy had one or two slaves here and there, but by and large, it was the large plantations. So the North, Lincoln didn't see the average Southerner fighting for the rich guy to preserve his slaves. But he forgot about nationalism and that people are going to say, hey, look, I'm from Alabama. You're not going to come down here and tell me what to do. I mean, those rich guys may be assholes, but there are assholes, and you assholes don't get to come down here and tell us how to run things. If we're going to secede, we have the right to secede. So both sides completely misjudged the resolve of the other. And I'll cut Lincoln a little bit of slack because you look at pictures of him from 1860 and 1861 early on, and you look at the last pictures of him from the end of his life in 1865, it looks like he aged not 4 years, but 10 or 15 years. So I don't think he was so much of a sociopath that he didn't realize what he had done. I think that towards the end there was a, oh my God, what have I done type thought going through his head. That's conjecture. But he did say that he would welcome the states back in as if they'd never left. Cut him a little bit of slack there. But overall, yeah, not cool, man. Not cool. So I know this has been a little bit long, but like I said, hey, it's a masterclass. Again, yeah, it's a self-described masterclass. But that's how it went. All right. Everything that's all factual. Everything factual beyond my opinions. That's all factual. Just connect the dots. Put two and two together. What other reason is there for Lincoln to have done what he did, but other than to consolidate federal power? And we're dealing with the consequences today. And we need to go back to that pre-war between the states mentality. One of the things we could do, Mark Levin wrote a book a few years ago, Liberty Amendments, one of them being that if within 24 months, 2 years of a federal law being passed, if 60% of the states vote to repeal it, it gets repealed. I'm talking stuff like that. So I'm not talking about any more violence or bloodshed or going back. Again, this ain't no neo-Confederate bullshit. Don't even go there. This is making people aware of history, why it's important, and that the federal government wasn't supposed to be that powerful. And now look at it. Bloated, way out of regulations, man. You're out of regs. Military lingo. Doing extra constitutional shit. It's got no business being, no business doing. And here's the big thing. Think about this. Before the war between the states, we referred to ourselves as these United States. Now, I know in the Constitution it says the United States because they're referring to the government of the United States, but we refer to ourselves as these United States. These states united. Now, we're the United States. Be excellent to each other. Sic semper tyrannis. Long live the Republic. And God bless.